What happens when arrogance collides with hidden talent? Imagine walking into a grand living room, the kind of space where every detail screams wealth, shiny marble floors, golden chandeliers, and in the center, an immaculate grand piano polished to perfection. Now picture a millionaire storming into that very room, his voice cutting like a blade through the silence, as he yells at his maid for daring to touch the one thing he considers untouchable. Have you ever seen someone humiliated for simply being curious, for reaching towards something that wasn't meant for them? Stay with me, because what unfolds from this moment is not what anyone expected. This is the story of Mr. Thompson, a man whose fortune built him walls higher than any skyscraper, and Emily, a young woman who quietly worked behind the scenes of his mansion in the suburbs of New York. For Emily, the piano was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a reminder of a dream she once held, of melodies she used to practice on an old, battered keyboard back home. But for Mr. Thompson, that piano was the crown jewel of his collection, untouchable, untouching, reserved only for admiration. And so, when he caught Emily brushing her fingers across the keys, the fury in his voice echoed like thunder through the house. Humiliation. That's what she felt as his words landed heavy in front of the staff, as if she had committed the worst crime imaginable. Isn't it strange how quickly power can turn kindness into cruelty? What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because in that single moment of rage, Mr. Thompson thought he was proving his superiority. But instead, he set the stage for a revelation that would silence every sneer, every ounce of arrogance, and even his own pride. Close your eyes for a second and imagine being in Emily's shoes. The sting of shame on your face, the heat of everyone's eyes watching, and yet, deep inside, a fire begins to burn. Have you ever been through this? When someone underestimated you, dismissed you, or judged you before even knowing what you carried within? That's where Emily stood. Her heart pounding, her hands trembling not just with fear, but with something much stronger, the desire to be heard, to be seen for who she truly was. Mr. Thompson didn't know that behind her silence was a story. He didn't know that her father once played jazz in tiny bars, that music was the only inheritance she carried from a childhood cut short by hardship. He didn't know that the sound of a piano wasn't just noise to her, it was a lifeline. All he saw was a maid, someone who should clean the dust from under the keys, not dare to let them sing. But life has a way of turning arrogance into humility in the most unexpected ways. As his voice grew louder, as the shame tightened around her like a noose, Emily faced a choice: bow her head and walk away, or let the music inside her speak louder than his insults. What she decided in that moment would not only change how everyone in that mansion looked at her, it would shake Mr. Thompson to his very core. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next transformed a scene of humiliation into one of the most unforgettable lessons in humility, respect, and the power of hidden talent. And as the silence in that grand living room grew heavier, a single sound was about to break it, one that would leave every soul present in awe. And that's exactly where our story begins. And as you imagine that moment, the tension in the room, the weight of arrogance pressing down on someone so undeserving of it, I want to pause and invite you into this story, because this isn't just about Mr. Thompson and Emily. In many ways, it's about all of us. How many times have you felt dismissed, underestimated, or silenced simply because someone thought they knew your worth better than you? If this thought stirs something in you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments below. Your voice, your story, your perspective. It matters here. When you open up, you're not just leaving words on a screen. You're reminding someone else that they're not alone in their own struggle. And if you're finding meaning in this journey, if this story is echoing in your heart the way it was meant to, take a moment to like this video. It may seem like a small action, but it's what helps this channel continue to bring more stories like this. Stories that remind us of resilience, dignity, and the quiet power hidden in Ordinary lives, each like is a signal that says, keep going, keep telling these stories. They matter. Of course, I'd love for you to subscribe too. Not because it's just another button to click, but because by subscribing, you're choosing to walk alongside these narratives, to be part of a community that values lessons in humility, redemption, and hope. When you subscribe, you're helping this channel grow into a place where more people can pause their busy lives, reflect, and maybe even find a little strength for their own journeys. So let this be a conversation, not a monologue. Comment, like, subscribe, not for the numbers, but for the connection, for the chance to spread these messages further. Your presence here changes the reach of this story, and perhaps it changes the way someone out there sees themselves too. Now let's return to that living room, where Emily's trembling fingers hovered over the keys, and silence hung heavy in the air. The next note she played was about to rewrite everything. Mr. Thompson was the kind of man people in his neighborhood spoke of in hushed voices. He didn't just live in wealth, he embodied it, wrapped himself in it as if it were a suit of armor. His mansion in Westchester wasn't simply a home, it was a statement. Everything about it was designed to impress: the perfectly trimmed hedges, the imported marble floors, the chandelier flown in from Italy, the private wine cellar that could rival a restaurant's. But more than all of that, there was the piano, a glossy black Steinway sitting proudly in the center of his living room. It wasn't played, not really. For Mr. Thompson, it wasn't about the music, it was about the message. The piano whispered of status, of refinement, of cultural superiority, and he guarded it as if it were a crown jewel. People who worked in his house knew better than to breathe too close to it. The cleaning staff were told to polish it gently with gloves, never with bare hands, and absolutely never to let the keys sing. To him, the piano was sacred, but not for what it could produce, for what it represented, a symbol of his place above others. It wasn't about harmony or creativity, it was about control. Mr. Thompson had built his fortune in the finance world, navigating boardrooms with the same intensity he showed at home. He prided himself on discipline, on the image he presented to investors and socialites. His pride wasn't just in the millions he had, but in the appearance of perfection that surrounded him. To anyone looking in, he was the man who had it all, but those who worked close to him knew the truth. He carried his wealth like a shield, and that shield left little space for kindness. Emily saw this long before the incident with the piano. She had only been working in the mansion for 6 months, but in that time she noticed the way Mr. Thompson's eyes sharpened whenever something wasn't exactly as he wanted. A glass out of place, a rug slightly uneven, the faintest fingerprint on a polished surface. Nothing escaped him, and nothing softened his reaction. He wasn't violent, but his words could cut sharper than any blade. Emily wasn't used to luxury. She came from the other side of New York, where dreams were often postponed by reality. Her childhood home was small, crowded with siblings, and filled with the smell of her mother's cooking stretching as far as it could to feed everyone. She learned early what sacrifice meant. While her friends in high school dreamed of going to college, Emily had to make decisions most teenagers don't, working evenings and weekends to keep the lights on, to make sure her younger brother could stay in school. Her job at Mr. Thompson's mansion wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady meant survival. She didn't complain. She was the type of person who noticed details, who remembered things others forgot. Quiet, observant, she absorbed the world around her like a sponge. And though she hardly ever spoke in the house, she had an entire symphony playing silently inside her mind. It started when she was little. Her father, a man who never had much money but carried a heart bigger than his pockets, would sit her on his lap at a worn-out keyboard. The instrument was missing keys, the sound sometimes off-pitch, but to Emily it was magic. Music, her father would say, isn't about how perfect the instrument is. It's about what you put into it. Those words etched themselves into her memory long after he was gone. The piano became her secret world, a hidden truth she carried while cleaning the echoing halls of wealth. Emily Her younger brother would often whisper late at night, "Play something, just one song before bed," and she would, softly pressing the plastic keys of a thrift store keyboard, filling their tiny apartment with melodies that made the walls feel less heavy. Music wasn't just sound, it was survival, a form of resilience, a way to transform the emptiness around her into something alive. That's why, when she stood in Mr. Thompson's living room, dusting near the grand piano, she couldn't resist. Just one touch, just a single brush of her finger across the ivory. The sound was like a secret being spoken aloud, and for a fleeting second she felt that familiar fire in her chest. But Mr. Thompson didn't see it that way. To him, it was trespassing. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice thundered, sharp enough to freeze her in place. Emily's cheeks burned. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean," he cut her off, stepping closer, his shadow falling heavy over her. "That piano is worth more than you'll see in your entire lifetime. You're here to clean, not to meddle with things you can't understand." The words stung, not because of their cruelty, but because of how easily they dismissed her entire being. He saw her as invisible, yet too visible when she crossed his invisible line. Around them, the other staff looked away, pretending not to hear, as if this were just another scene in a house where wealth dictated every interaction. But Emily didn't lower her eyes. Not this time. Something in her chest shifted. A decision was forming. Not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind that changes the direction of a life quietly, behind the scenes. Mr. Thompson noticed the flicker of defiance in her gaze. "Do you even know what those keys are capable of? They're not toys for servants. They're instruments of art. And you—" He paused, almost laughing at the thought. "You think you belong there?" Emily's voice was soft, almost trembling, but steady enough to carry through the silence. "I grew up with a piano, sir. I know what it means." The room seemed to tighten around her words. For a moment, even Mr. Thompson was caught off guard, not because he believed her, but because he hadn't expected her to respond at all. In his world, maids didn't speak back. They didn't carry stories. They didn't hold truths beyond their tasks. But Emily wasn't just carrying a duster and a cloth. She was carrying years of untold music, a hidden truth, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Her life had been a journey of silence, of resilience, of decisions made in the shadows. And now, standing before a man who believed he controlled the script, she was ready to improvise her own. The mansion, with all its marble and gold, suddenly felt like a stage. And the Steinway, polished and untouchable, waited like a character in the story, ready to change everything. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer, the air heavy with tension, the moment hanging on the edge of transformation. What came next would test not only her courage, but the very foundations of Mr. Thompson's pride, and the impact would ripple far beyond that living room. The piano in Mr. Thompson's mansion wasn't just an instrument, it was a monument, an object deliberately placed in the center of the living room so that anyone who entered would see it first. Its glossy, black finish reflected the chandeliers above like a mirror, and the ivory keys gleamed as if they had never been touched. For Mr. Thompson, it was never meant to be played. It was a symbol, a piece of art, frozen in time, carrying the weight of his pride and the image he projected to the world. He often told guests during his elaborate dinner parties, "That's a Steinway, imported, custom-designed, one of the finest you'll ever see." The statement was less about the piano itself and more about what it said about him. Every time his voice rang with those words, it wasn't music filling the room, but ego. He would stand with a glass of wine in his hand, recounting the story of how he purchased it at an auction, how collectors envied his acquisition. People would nod, impressed, as though the piano's value was somehow an extension of his own. But behind the applause and polite admiration, the truth lingered. No one had ever heard it sing. It was more decoration than melody, a treasure locked, behind invisible chains. Mr. Thompson preferred it that way. He was not interested in its voice, only in the status it gave him. Emily, however, saw something entirely different. Each time she dusted its polished surface, she felt an ache. To her, the piano wasn't just a piece of expensive furniture, it was a doorway to another life. She could almost hear the notes waiting, trapped inside, begging to be released. It reminded her of the days when her father's worn keyboard filled their small apartment with laughter and warmth. The keys might have been cracked, the sound imperfect, but the music carried something money could never buy: connection. Standing near the Steinway, she often wondered if Mr. Thompson had ever felt that kind of connection, or if he only measured life in numbers and possessions. To Emily, the piano symbolized not wealth, but freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom to feel, freedom to transform silence into something alive. Where Mr. Thompson saw exclusivity, Emily saw possibility. Why would someone own such a beautiful instrument and never let it speak? She whispered to herself once, running her cloth carefully along the edge. Her words were swallowed by the cavernous room, unheard by anyone else. That was the hidden truth. The piano represented the gap between them. For Mr. Thompson, it was a fortress built to protect his pride. For Emily, it was a bridge to her forgotten dreams. And as she stood before it, the contrast between those two worlds became almost unbearable. Mr. Thompson had spent years curating his life to perfection. The piano was part of that curation, no different from the art on the walls or the crystal glasses in his cabinet. It was a symbol of arrival, proof of a journey from modest beginnings to unimaginable wealth. He often reminded people that his father had been a factory worker and that he had clawed his way out of that life through determination and an unshakable mindset. What he failed to see was that in his pursuit of status, he had built walls higher than the ones he thought he'd escaped. The piano, silent and untouched, was one of those walls. Emily's journey was the opposite. She hadn't yet escaped the weight of financial struggle, but she carried with her something Mr. Thompson had lost along the way: the ability to find joy in simplicity. Where he guarded the piano as a relic of wealth, she remembered it as a friend. For her, music wasn't about ownership, it was about expression, about the courage to let emotions breathe through sound. She never thought of herself as poor when she played, she thought of herself as whole. "I used to imagine," Emily later confessed in a whisper, "that one day I'd sit at a real piano, not the kind missing keys, and I'd play without fear that someone might tell me to stop." That dream had never left her. Even while scrubbing floors or carrying trays, the melody lived inside her, waiting. The Steinway was, in a way, the perfect symbol of the hidden tension between them. It embodied wealth without meaning for Mr. Thompson, and meaning without access for Emily. To him, it was a shield that proved his superiority. To her, it was a reminder of everything she had lost, but also of everything she still hoped to find. It was both a barrier and a promise, depending on whose eyes looked upon it. The mansion itself seemed to echo that duality. Guests saw grandeur, elegance, the kind of lifestyle most people only read about in glossy magazines. Emily saw the behind-the-scenes truth, the long hours of preparation, the fragile illusion that perfection could be maintained, the loneliness of a house so large it swallowed warmth. And in the middle of it all stood the piano, gleaming and silent, like a secret neither of them could yet admit aloud. It wasn't just a question of music. The piano represented choices, decisions, and the impact of those decisions on the people around them. Mr. Thompson had decided long ago that appearances mattered more than authenticity. Emily, in her quiet way, had decided that authenticity was all she had left. The piano stood as the battlefield for those opposing mindsets. There was a reason Emily's hands trembled when she dared to touch it. It wasn't only fear of being caught. It was the weight of everything it symbolized pressing against her fingertips. That single sound, The brief echo of a note in the grand hall carried her back to the nights when her father encouraged her to believe in something bigger than their circumstances. She could feel that music still living in her bones, waiting to remind her who she was. But Mr. Thompson heard none of that. To him, the note was an intrusion, a crack in the armor he so carefully built. His wealth was meant to keep people like Emily at a distance, to remind them of their place, and yet, in that moment, the piano betrayed him. It whispered the truth he had long buried. That beauty means nothing if it is never shared. Emily didn't yet know the impact her touch would have, but something inside her shifted. For years, she had carried her music like a secret, but standing in that room, she realized secrets only hold power when they remain hidden. Once revealed, they could transform everything. The piano wasn't just an object anymore, it was an invitation to step across the invisible line drawn between wealth and poverty, arrogance and humility, silence and expression. Mr. Thompson, standing there with his voice raised and his pride wounded, couldn't see that transformation yet, but Emily could feel it. In her heart, the piano was no longer his possession, it was her opportunity, and as the tension in the room thickened, the air itself seemed to wait, heavy with the promise of revelations yet to come, each one more powerful than the last. Emily didn't mean to press the key. It was the kind of touch that happens when memory reaches out before the mind approves, an instinct, a reflex from years of small rooms and late-night lullabies. Her fingertip grazed the ivory, and a single note escaped into the vast living room, thin at first, then blooming as it climbed the high ceiling and drifted down the marble staircase like a secret. For a breath, the house seemed to listen back. The chandeliers gave off a steady hum, the afternoon light settled on the polished lid, and in the shine she saw a small reflection of herself. Not a maid in a pressed uniform, but the girl who used to lean over a battered keyboard and find courage in sound. Just a touch, she mouthed to herself, like an apology and a promise in one. The air carried the note down the corridor toward the front hall, where footsteps were already approaching, brisk and certain, the cadence of a man who expected his will to be the rule and his rules to be the world. The double doors swung wide with a practiced force, and Mr. Thompson stepped in, jaw tight, cufflinks flashing, phone still in his hand, as if the conversation he'd left behind was somehow less urgent than the offense in front of him. The sound of that single note had the impact of a challenge, tiny but undeniable, and his face hardened into the expression people in his circles recognized as final. "What do you think you're doing?" he said. But the acoustics turned it into something bigger, an accusation amplified by the wealth of the room. He didn't wait for an answer. Men who live inside their own certainty rarely do. He moved closer, each step a reminder of the imbalance. Between them, his presence, her place, his property, her paycheck. Emily's hand left the key and went automatically to the cloth at her side, the familiar shield of routine. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, steady but small, the way one speaks when the goal is to calm rather than convince. The housekeeper, Mrs. Green, hovered near the archway, her eyes pleading without words. A gardener delivering fresh flowers froze beside a pedestal. From the hallway came the echo of 2 weekend guests, friends from the city who had driven up for lunch and a tour, pausing mid-sentence. The mansion's behind-the-scenes machine had rolled into view, and for once, the front-of-house spectacle had collided with it. Mr. Thompson let the phone slip into his pocket and took another step, close enough that she could see the careful carelessness of his grooming, the control in the part of his hair, the deliberate stillness of a man who preferred owning to feeling. "That piano is not a toy," he said, each syllable clipped, measured for effect. "It's an instrument of art, an investment. It's not meant for staff to experiment." He held the last word like he was allergic to it. "Do you understand the difference?" "I do," Emily said, wishing the floor would stop reflecting their shapes back at her. "I was dusting and You what? Decided you'd try your hand at a Steinway like it's some thrift store keyboard?" His laugh was short and sharp. People spend years training to be near this. Years, miss. What is it again? Emily, she said. And then, because she didn't want Mrs. Green to answer for her like a parent at a principal's office, Emily Miller. Well, Emily Miller, he said, rolling her name as if testing whether it was worth remembering. Your job is to clean, not to pretend, not to imagine, not to press keys because you felt like it. We have rules here. His tone suggested that he believed rules were holy only when written by men like him, a mindset polished by decades of boardroom victories and reinforced by the applause of guests who loved his certainty because it steadied their own. From the doorway, one of the guests, Olivia, a friend from his investor circle, shifted uncomfortably. She knew this stance. She had seen versions of it across long tables while deals were being made, men flattening dissent with tone rather than evidence. But here it felt different. Here it landed on someone who had no defense, but dignity. Emily swallowed, not to hide fear, but to keep her voice from breaking the way. Long-held notes sometimes fracture at the edge of breath. I wasn't pretending, she said, quieter than she wanted to be, yet clear enough to be heard. I grew up with a piano. I know I shouldn't have touched it. I'm sorry. He moved closer, too close for comfort, but far enough to maintain the performance of decorum. You grew up with a piano, he repeated, as if the sentence were a script he could rearrange into a joke. In what world? Because in this one, we respect boundaries. We don't test them to see if they'll hold. He gestured to the keys, open now like a line of teeth behind a smile that wasn't. Do you know what those cost? Do you know? Sir, Mrs. Green started, her voice soft, a hand rising as though to catch glassware. She meant no harm. He didn't turn to her. That's the problem. People who mean no harm often cause it. It starts small. One key, one rule, one exception. His gaze returned to Emily, daring her to disagree. I didn't come here to break anything, Emily said, and the memory of her father's voice steadied her. I came to work, and I do respect your rules. Then remember them, he said. This house runs because everyone knows their lane. He delivered the sentence the way he signed contracts. Decisive, closing, final. The room felt colder as it settled around his decision, the kind of climate shift that happens without wind, a change born of tone rather than weather. The florist set the bouquet down with the caution of a paramedic. Olivia glanced at the other guest, James, who stared at the piano as if it might answer for the room. There was an unspoken ledger ticking in the background, his status against her station, his authority against her apology. Power doesn't need volume to be loud, it needs certainty. He had it in full. She had only her breath and the conviction that something true lived inside her, a hidden truth that had a right to stand up even when it wasn't invited to sit down. Sir, Emily said, and it surprised her that her voice didn't shake. I know what this is worth to you. She paused, searching for a footing in a place designed to knock people like her off balance. But I also know what it's worth, in a different way. He smirked. A different way. It's not just a number, she said, not to everyone. There was a soft rustle behind them. Josh from security had stepped into the threshold, pretending to check the hallway while actually measuring the moment. Houses like this had their own choreography. He knew when to appear, as if called by an invisible cue. Olivia looked down at her phone, not to escape, but to soften the eye contact that now felt like a spotlight. The pianist that the piano had never hosted was standing beside it, and the owner who never let it sing was policing the air around it, guarding silence as if sound were a trespass. Mr. Thompson turned slightly, voice projecting not just to Emily, but to the witnesses who would carry this story into other rooms. This is how things get lost, he announced, the way executives summarize a lesson after a crisis debrief. Standards erode. People forget their role. A house like this, an institution like my company, depends on order. Decisions are made by those who understand the cost of mistakes. He snapped his fingers once, not at her, but near her. a barely audible percussion that said, "Return to your post." Her eyes didn't flinch. "I understand the cost of mistakes," she said. "I also understand the cost of never trying." He stopped moving. For the first time, the ground he stood on, not the marble but the argument, shifted imperceptibly. He had trained himself to hear risk in words, and hers contained risk he couldn't price. The room's energy tilted. Even the flowers on the pedestal leaned slightly, as if hoping gravity might pull compassion down into the man before them. She didn't step back. She placed her palm on the edge of the piano, not the keys, lightly, like greeting a friend you aren't sure still remembers you. The habit of deference warred with the memory of music. This was the quiet crossroads of mindset and courage, the small, internal decision that shapes a life before anyone else can see it. She could retreat and live with the echo of this humiliation, or she could stand inside the truth she carried and let it breathe, even if it earned her a harsher sentence. Both options hurt. Only one offered transformation. "Look at me," he said, and she did. For a second, he saw something he had not prepared for, a steadiness that was not defiance but presence. It wasn't the bravado of someone picking a fight. It was the gravity of someone choosing not to disappear. He had spent years developing the instinct to recognize leverage and apply it mercilessly. He was good at pushing people into silence. Today, silence seemed to be pushing back. "You're making this larger than it is," he said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince the room or himself. "It's a boundary, that's all. Boundaries matter," she replied, and her voice carried the shape of the life that taught her that. "So does what's inside them." Olivia took a small step forward, as if to water down the heat with a joke, then thought better of it. The truth was too visible to cover with a laugh. James crossed his arms and stared at the floor, not out of boredom, but because the scene forced him to examine a version of himself he preferred to ignore. The mansion, usually proud of its sheen, now reflected a different kind of inspection, a behind-the-scenes inventory of values. "You think that because you can play a few notes you're entitled to this?" Mr. Thompson asked, gesturing to the room, the instrument, the world. "I don't think I'm entitled to anything," Emily said. "I think music belongs to the people who can hear it." He blinked, slow, like the idea had floated across the distance and tapped him on the shoulder. His reply arrived colder than before, the way air feels after a door slams. "Pack your things. I can't run a household that tolerates overreach." Mrs. Green inhaled sharply. "Sir, please, He lifted a hand. "I have made my decision." Emily absorbed the words as if they were hail, sharp, sudden, icy, and then let them melt before they found a home. She didn't plead. The journey that brought her here had already taught her what begging costs the spirit. "If that's what you need to do," she said, not bravely, not dramatically, just honestly, "then okay." He waited for collapse, for apology to mutate into panic, but it didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged. She turned her head toward the piano, and the room, drawn by a gravity it didn't understand, followed her gaze. Some moments are loud without noise. This was one. He could feel control adjusting its weight in his hand, suddenly heavier than usual. She lifted the fallboard with care like she was uncovering a relic in a museum, and the keys caught the light. In small white rectangles, her fingers hovered over them, and the memory was immediate. Her father's laughter, the thrift store keyboard, the tiny apartment that felt like a cathedral when a melody found it. "I'm not trying to prove anything to you," she said, not looking up, speaking to the instrument more than to him. "I just need to remember who I am." "Don't," he said, but it sounded less like a command than a reflex. "I won't break it," she said. "I promise." She pulled the bench an inch. The soft scrape, a line drawn on polished stone. In the glass of the framed art behind the piano, her reflection aligned with the room's opulence in a way that rewrote the scene. Not intruder and owner, but musician and instrument. She exhaled, and it felt like letting go of a ledge. Olivia's voice arrived gently, surprising even herself. "Maybe. Let her finish," she murmured toward Mr. Thompson, then fell quiet because she wasn't ready to see his reaction to her small betrayal. James didn't speak, but his chin dipped in agreement, almost imperceptible. Josh remained in the doorway, hands clasped, face neutral, yet his stance had shifted from sentinel to witness. The keys were cool under Emily's fingertips, a clean contrast to the warmth of her palms. She knew the danger. Jobs were not easy to find, rent not easy to pay, promises to family not easy to keep. But she also knew a different danger, the one that grows when you refuse the truth you carry. Where some saw rule-breaking, she saw a decision to honor what had saved her more than once. This wasn't rebellion, it was remembrance. Mr. Thompson's breath caught, a small snag he hoped no one would notice. He hadn't planned for this fork in the road, and he disliked forks he didn't place there himself. He was a man of strategy, accustomed to drafting outcomes and signing them into reality. Yet here was a variable he couldn't calculate, the impact of a note played by someone he'd taught himself not to see. Emily's hands settled, one just above middle C, the other ready to map the chord she knew by muscle memory and heart. The house seemed to lean in, listening for what would come next, the way an audience anticipates the first word of a confession. The imbalance of power hadn't vanished, but it had adjusted. His anger, once a wave, now felt more like a tide receding from the shore of her silence, making room for something else to arrive. She closed her eyes only long enough to find the first interval, then opened them again, determined to meet this moment fully awake. And without any flourish, she took the breath that musicians take when decisions become sound and stories step forward to be heard. Mr. Thompson's voice returned before the first note could find its courage, crisp and final, the familiar instrument of a man used to cutting through hesitation. He straightened his jacket like a judge fixing his robe. "All right," he said, the words carrying more calculation than temper now. "You say, you know what this means. Prove it, or you can collect your things and be off the property by dinner." He let the sentence hang with the weight of a signature. It wasn't just a demand. It was a decision shaped into sound. Emily felt it land, heavy and cold, then shift inside her into something warmer, a kind of steadying heat. She sat. The bench sighed a little beneath her, as if relieved to be serving its true purpose, and her knees brushed the underside of the keyboard, the way old friends sometimes bump shoulders before they remember how to walk together. Her fingers hovered where she'd left them, the space above the keys a narrow border between past and present. In that pause, the room organized itself into watchers. Mrs. Green at the archway, hands folded as if in prayer. Olivia with a heel turned slightly inward, the tell of a person leaning into a reveal. James with his arms loose now instead of crossed, curiosity slipping past caution. Josh, a still frame in the doorway, a houseman halfway down the hall, holding his breath over a silver tray. Even the afternoon seemed to wait, the light slow and viscous through the high windows, the dust motes lifting and falling like a quiet audience. Emily inhaled and heard her father in that breath. "Decide who you are before anyone else does, kiddo." And a second later, the decision clicked into place. "I'm going to play," she said, not to defy him, but to join herself. "I won't touch anything I don't need to. Just listen. And time is the only thing you're wasting," Mr. Thompson replied, but the edge had softened, curiosity creeping in despite the armor. "Go on, show us." She began with 3 notes that leaned into each other like people threading through a crowded sidewalk, careful and considerate, a melody soft enough to pass for a memory. Her hands were trembling. She didn't hide it, didn't fight it. The tremor made the first phrase human. A minor color rose in the second measure and set down a feeling no words in. The room had been permitted to carry, tenderness without permission. The sound wasn't big, it didn't need to be. It traced the edges of the living room and tested the acoustics like a bird testing a branch after winter. The chandelier answered with a delicate shimmer, Somewhere in the back corridor, the grandfather clock forgot to chime on the quarter hour, as if time itself had paused to negotiate new terms. "I used to start here," she murmured almost to herself, a private map spoken aloud. Because it quieted the noise from the street. The memory guided her through a progression that turned the room from glass into wood, warmer, closer. Olivia's shoulders dropped a fraction. James let out a small breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Mr. Thompson stood straighter, as if good posture might manage the situation back into his control. He tried to fix the moment to a hypothesis. Perhaps she knew a simple tune. Perhaps this would be over in 30 seconds. Emily's right hand moved, on the line gathering a little strength, like a voice finding pitch after a long silence. Her left hand joined, hesitantly at first, then with a deepening trust, laying down soft chords that lifted the melody and gave it a place to land. The house changed shape around the harmony. It was the same square footage, the same marble, the same curated art, but the sound tracked a different blueprint, a behind-the-scenes floor plan stitched from feeling. It passed the staircase like a rumor and made its way to the gallery, where it arranged the framed photographs into a timeline that actually made sense. It skimmed across the kitchen tile and gentled the stainless steel into something less severe. In the living room, fabric softened, edges rounded. The air grew bearable for everyone, even for him. "I learned this part from my dad," she said, and the next phrase opened like a window onto a summer nobody here had seen. The theme gathered detail, turns and suspensions, small revelations tucked into the space between tones. The tremor in her hands steadied. The fear that had rushed to the surface realized it wasn't needed and withdrew, leaving clarity. This wasn't performance for approval. It was an act of remembering. The effect was immediate and disarming. The same keys Mr. Thompson guarded as artifacts became messengers. Notes rose and fell with the cadence of a story finally permitted to proceed. By the second pass through the motif, the melody carried a spine. Emily let her write and reach a little higher, the shape of the line widening, the intervals daring more space. The center of the room shifted from where he stood to where she sat, and yet nothing felt stolen. The power moved without theft, like sunlight sliding across a floor as the day changes its angle. Olivia blinked quickly and then stopped blinking altogether, her eyes finding a point just above the lid where you can watch without intruding. James had uncrossed not just his arms, but his assumptions. Mrs. Green's lips parted around a smile she didn't release. She didn't want anything so ordinary as a smile to break the moment. The left hand built a foundation, deeper now, a pulse that recognized the human heart and matched it. The bass wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, like the truth that exists before you find the words for it. The melody answered by blooming into a phrase that could have been a question until the final note settled it into an answer. The call and response of two hands turned into the conversation a person has with themselves when no one else is around. Underneath it all, Emily sat straighter, not in pride, but in alignment, her body remembering the posture that allows sound to move like water finds its level. "What is this?" Olivia whispered toward no one and someone. It wasn't curiosity about the composer. It was curiosity about herself, about why the music knew the path to a room she'd kept locked. "It's nothing," Mr. Thompson said automatically, then revised, almost under his breath. "It's familiar." The admission surprised him. He tried to assemble explanation. Perhaps he had heard it at a charity gala, perhaps in a film, but the search for context kept losing to the presence of the moment. He watched her wrists and realized he was measuring the wrong thing. He had spent a lifetime quantifying impact in markets and margin, and missed that impact also has a texture, a warmth that audits the soul instead of the spreadsheet. Emily's eyes stayed on the keys, but her attention widened. She felt the room's anger drain away the way tide empties a bay, leaving sand with new patterns. The second section arrived, the one she'd always treated as a turning lane. Here, the melody climbed, and then paused on a note that asked for patience, suspending time without demanding it. "This is where I used to decide," she said softly. "Do I keep it safe, or do I go where it hurts?" She let the note linger long enough for the room to notice the question, then continued, choosing the harder road, the road where minor becomes a promise rather than a warning. The sound grew bigger, not from volume, but from intention. Chords widened, space filled. Her left hand ventured lower, found a gravity that could carry the risk. She didn't pound. She didn't need to. The power came from conviction. Josh eased his stance, weight off the back foot. The florist, returning with ribbon, stopped in the hallway and set the spool on a console as if placing an offering. In the kitchen, a kettle clicked off and no one moved to pour it. The staff knew instinctively that sound was now the house's work. Even the great panes of glass along the north wall forgot to glare and instead turned transparent, letting the late sun pour in like approbation. The mansion, so often an echo chamber of wealth, became a sanctuary for something money can't stage. "I didn't know she could do this," Mrs. Green whispered, the words breaking free as a confession. "You weren't supposed to," Emily said, but this time the words were only in her head. Aloud, she gave the room a modulation that felt like a revelation discovered rather than performed. A hidden truth stepped forward, unashamed of its plain clothes. The phrase crested, held, and then descended with the careful logic of forgiveness. The transition looked easy, like all mastery does when it refuses to brag. Mr. Thompson felt it first as an irritation. How dare the atmosphere refuse his preference? And then as a loosening. In the chest he mistook at first for annoyance. Somewhere in the coil of his shoulders, a knot he'd considered structural shifted. He remembered a sound from a kitchen radio long ago, a woman humming while making pancakes, a Saturday where bills piled on the counter like uncashed threats, and the song somehow made the room big enough to hold fear without collapsing. He had not visited that house in years. He had turned it into a story about grit, a prelude he told investors to romance his resilience. The music changed the lighting on that story. It revealed not grit, but grace, someone else's sacrifice holding up the scaffolding he later called self-made. He didn't like the feeling. He didn't dislike it either. He simply didn't know where to file it. Emily moved into the heart of the piece with the calm of a person who knows her own map. The tremble had become intention. The intention had become voice. Her right hand sang a line that sounded like a door opening, not suddenly, but with the dignified swing of something that has always been unlocked. The left hand rolled a chord that sounded like welcome. The room, which had gathered earlier to witness a humiliation, now found itself recruited into a witness of another kind. Scorn has a short attention span. Awe can be patient. "I used to think I had to earn permission to touch beauty," Emily thought, letting the words ride a soft arpeggio. Turns out, beauty was the permission. She didn't speak. The music carried it for her. In that moment, she wasn't defending herself to him or to the rules or to the paycheck. She was defending music to a house that had forgotten what it was for. That's the mindset that shifts a scene from conflict to transformation. Not aggression, not retreat, but remembering the function of a thing and treating it accordingly. The dynamic swelled, not loud for loudness's sake, but because the truth had more room now and took it. The theme returned with new weight, the way a person returns to a street after years away and notices how their stride edits the place. Emily allowed a small rubato, time bending just enough to let feeling breathe without losing the beat. The effect was tenderness, with backbone. The notes landed like steps set carefully on a floor that once felt slippery. "Enough," Mr. Thompson said suddenly, but even he heard that the word was not an order. It was a plea at the edge of surrender. He couldn't name what he was surrendering. Perhaps the lie that value requires distance, perhaps the habit of confusing silence with control. He looked at the guests and found no approval, no audience ready to laugh on cue. He found faces open, willing, newly honest. He recognized that openness because he had trained himself to close it. She reached the cadence that, in any other living room, would have invited applause. She didn't close. She let the final chord of the section ring, then thinned it into a filament, then into a single note held just long enough to turn strength into listening. When she released it, the silence that followed felt earned, like the breath at the end of a confession that leaves the room better than it found it. The mansion stayed quiet. No one dared translate what they'd heard into clumsy summary. Emily lifted her hands and rested them in her lap without leaving the bench, spine tall, eyes on the keys. She wasn't seeking permission for what came next. She was letting the moment collect itself, letting the impact of this small rebellion, no, not rebellion, restoration, settle where it needed to. She could feel it in the room, decisions rearranging themselves, narratives adjusting their posture, a hierarchy checking its math. She didn't look at Mr. Thompson yet. She wanted to meet him in the exact second when he was most himself, not the performance of himself. He stared at the instrument like it had turned witness against him. "Who taught you that?" he asked, and the question was almost gentle. "My father," she said, "and rent, and choosing not to quit." She let the smallest smile rise and then fall, mostly the last one. Olivia's voice floated into the space left by the last overtone. "It's beautiful," she said, and the word didn't sound like flattery. It sounded like a report. James nodded, eyes still on the keys, as if mapping them to a version of himself he was trying to learn to play. Mrs. Green blinked away the water gathering, not to hide it, but to keep it from interfering with the view. Emily set. Her fingers again, lighter, the way you touch the shoulder of someone who has just told you a hard truth and is still catching their breath. She didn't need to be asked to continue, and no one needed to say yes. The room had learned the etiquette of listening. She drew up the next phrase, one she had saved for moments when she needed to remind herself that humility is not humiliation, and let it hang at the threshold, neither in nor out. The house took one collective breath with her, and the story, already changed, leaned forward toward the next note. The moment Emily's fingers lifted from the keys, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, alive with the echoes of what had just filled the air. It was the kind of silence that makes people afraid to shift their weight or even breathe too loudly, as if the sound of a shoe scuffing against marble might break something sacred. For a few seconds, no one dared move. The room had been transformed from a stage of humiliation into a sanctuary of revelation, and everyone present felt it pressing against their chests. Mrs. Green, who had worked for Mr. Thompson longer than anyone else, stood with her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. She had seen arguments flare in this house, seen guests lose their tempers, seen the master of the house slice people down with words sharp enough to leave scars that didn't show. But she had never seen this. Her lips parted, as if to whisper a prayer, but no words came. Tears brimmed against her will, and she blinked them away, though her body betrayed her when her shoulders rose and fell in a trembling sigh. "My lord," she mouthed, her voice almost inaudible. Olivia, still standing near the doorway, felt her heart thudding in her ribcage. She had attended concerts at Carnegie Hall, had sat in the first row at charity galas where world-renowned pianists played, and yet what she had just witnessed carried more impact than those polished performances. Because this wasn't about technique, it was about truth. She felt the music reach inside her, tugging at a place she hadn't visited in years, a place where vulnerability was not a weakness, but a reminder of being alive. She found herself whispering to James, "She's not just playing, she's remembering." But James didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Emily, as though she held some hidden key to a door he didn't know he needed unlocked. James had grown up in comfort, in schools where music was a hobby rather than a lifeline. He recognized chords, scales, and rhythm, but he had never felt them as survival. Watching Emily, he saw the raw difference. It wasn't just a maid sitting at a millionaire's piano. It was someone carrying her entire story in her fingertips. It was the sound of a life that refused to break. And in that recognition, a slow shame crept over him. Shame not for her, but for himself. For all the times he had mistaken privilege for merit, for all the moments he had nodded along to Mr. Thompson's arrogance without ever questioning it. Josh, the security guard at the doorway, usually trained to scan the perimeter, found his gaze locked on the piano bench instead. His job was to anticipate threats, to measure risks, to be ready for decisions that carried consequences. And here he was, witnessing a different kind of decision unfold, one not marked by aggression but by courage. He felt his throat tighten, an unfamiliar lump he quickly swallowed down. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be seen only for the uniform and never for the man behind it. Emily's music had spoken directly to that place in him. He shifted his stance, not to look tougher, but because standing still felt suddenly impossible. Even the florist, who had returned quietly to adjust the arrangements in the hallway, stopped mid-step, his hand still clutching the ribbon that now hung uselessly at his side. He wasn't a guest, not part of the elite who filled the mansion on weekends, but he felt himself swept into the circle of witnesses. His eyes stung, and he muttered under his breath, "She's playing for all of us." The house itself seemed altered. The chandeliers refracted light differently, as though they too were leaning in to listen. The polished marble, so often cold and unyielding, reflected warmth for the first time. Even the art on the walls, portraits of solemn faces and landscapes purchased for prestige, seemed humbled by the authenticity that had just filled the room. And then there was Mr. Thompson. The man who had entered with thunder in his voice now stood utterly still. His jaw was set, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. He had expected to witness a mistake, perhaps even relish in the confirmation of his own superiority. Instead, he had been handed something he couldn't categorize, a performance that wasn't performance at all, but revelation. The hidden truth of Emily's life had unfolded right in front of him, and the impact was undeniable. For a brief second, a memory from his own childhood pierced through his defenses. He remembered sitting in a small kitchen, his mother humming while she stirred pancake batter, her voice weaving through the cheap radio music in the background. It wasn't a piano, but the feeling was the same. Love carried through sound. He had buried that memory beneath layers of ambition and ego, but Emily's melody had unearthed it, and with it came a pang of shame, not for her trespass, but for his blindness. He had spent years curating his life into perfection, collecting symbols of wealth, and yet he had forgotten what those symbols were meant to serve. He looked at her hands, steady now where they had once trembled, and for the first time in years he felt something shift in him. But Mr. Thompson's pride was not so easily dismantled. He masked the revelation with stillness, his face unreadable, but inside a quiet battle raged. Was this humility? Was this admiration? Or was it the sting of being proven wrong in front of others? His silence became its own confession. The absence of words spoke louder than the scorn he had thrown minutes earlier. The other staff members, drawn by the sound, now lingered discreetly in the back, their uniforms blending into the shadows, but their hearts pulled forward by what they had heard. Some pressed their hands together, others simply stood frozen, their eyes wide. For them, it was more than a beautiful melody. It was vindication, a reminder that even those overlooked, even those told to stay in their lane, carried depths no one could measure at a glance. Emily sat still on the bench, her hands resting gently in her lap, her breathing calm. She didn't look up right away, didn't seek approval or applause. She let the silence stretch, knowing the music still lived in it. Inside her, the trembling that had once threatened to undo her was replaced with a clarity she had never felt before. She thought of her father's words, of the nights she had played to quiet the chaos of her world, and she knew she had honored that legacy here, in the most unexpected of places. The mansion, once defined by power and hierarchy, now held something else entirely. The people inside were no longer just staff and guests, millionaire and maid. They were human beings caught in the same current of awe, their roles momentarily stripped away by the universality of music. Pride had melted into shame, shame had folded into humility, and humility had blossomed into awe. It was a transformation that no one had expected, least of all Mr. Thompson. Emily finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his, not defiantly, not submissively, but with quiet strength. She didn't need to say anything. The message was already there, lingering in the air like the final note of a song that refuses to die. And as he stared back at her, unable to summon the authority that once seemed so absolute, the room braced itself for what might come next, each heartbeat marking the anticipation of a revelation yet to unfold. For a man like Mr. Thompson, silence had always been a weapon. In boardrooms, it forced others to fill the void with nervous chatter. At his dinner parties, it made guests lean closer, desperate for a word that might signal approval. But this silence was different. This silence wasn't his. It belonged to her. Emily had created it, and now it wrapped itself around him, not with deference but with authority. He stood there, caught between two selves, the one who had barked at her minutes earlier, and the one who now felt the edges of that arrogance begin to splinter. The melody still lingered in his chest, an echo he couldn't shake. Against his will, it carried him backward, into a memory he hadn't touched in years. He was 8 years old again, sitting on a rickety wooden stool in a small Ohio kitchen that always smelled faintly of flour and soap. His mother, apron tied loosely at her waist, was humming while she kneaded dough. There had been a second-hand piano in the corner, a gift from a neighbor who couldn't keep it anymore. It was out of tune, some keys stubbornly silent, but to his mother it was enough. She'd sit beside him, her hands guiding his, reminding him that music wasn't about perfection. "Don't pound the keys, Michael," she would say softly, her voice kind even when she corrected him. "Listen to them. They'll tell you what they need if you let them." He hadn't thought of those words in decades. He had spent most of his life pretending they didn't matter, burying them under spreadsheets, contracts, and the grind of ambition. But now, hearing Emily play, it was as if his mother had returned, her voice stitched into the notes, whispering through the gaps of his carefully curated life. He felt a pang of shame ripple through him, sharp and unfamiliar. How many times had he told people the story of his rise? How he'd come from nothing, built everything with his own 2 hands, clawed his way into wealth. It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the full truth either. He had left out the quiet sacrifices of his mother, the compassion she had taught him, the humanity he had long abandoned. Instead of remembering her lessons, he had chosen to chase symbols of success, the chandelier, the marble, the Steinway. And in doing so, he had forgotten the very essence of what she wanted for him. As Emily's music settled into silence, he realized with a heaviness he couldn't ignore that he had become the kind of man his mother had once warned him about, a man who mistook possessions for purpose, a man who thought dignity could be measured in dollars, a man who silenced others not because he was strong, but because he was afraid of what their truth might reveal about him. He glanced at the faces around the room. Olivia's eyes glistened, her lips parted in awe. James stood still, shoulders slouched, as if the weight of recognition had landed on him too. Even Josh, the unflinching guard, seemed softened, his usual vigilance replaced with quiet respect. And then there was Emily, seated calmly at the piano bench, not gloating, not demanding recognition, just existing in her own truth. She wasn't the maid in that moment. She was the reminder of everything he had lost. Mr. Thompson swallowed hard, the sound loud in his own ears. He hated vulnerability, hated that feeling of being stripped bare in front of others. Yet he couldn't deny what had just happened. He saw himself reflected in her. Music, and it wasn't the reflection he had curated for the world. It wasn't the image of a powerful millionaire who controlled every outcome. It was the boy in the kitchen, hungry for approval, desperate to prove himself, but too afraid to listen to the lessons given freely by the woman who loved him most. "I used to play," he heard himself murmur, almost by accident. The words slipped out before he could catch them. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual command. Emily's eyes flickered up in surprise, but she didn't say anything. She just waited. That patience, that lack of judgment, disarmed him even more. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the kind that comes when pride collides with revelation. It wasn't that he had never been confronted before. Plenty of rivals had challenged him in business, but those battles were about strategy, about leverage. This was different. This was about dignity, about humanity, and he had no defense for that. A part of him wanted to lash out again, to reclaim control, to remind everyone in the room whose name was on the deed to this mansion. But another part, smaller, quieter, but suddenly undeniable, wanted to listen. That was the part that remembered his mother's touch on his shoulder as she leaned over the broken piano. That was the part that remembered compassion before it had calcified into ambition. His hands clenched at his sides, not out of anger now, but to steady himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. He had spent so long performing the role of the untouchable man that he had forgotten the boy who once knew what it felt like to be moved by something as simple as a song. The contrast shook him. The shame deepened when he thought about how he had spoken to her, how easily he had dismissed Emily as if her worth could be calculated by her paycheck. He realized, with a sting that reached deeper than he cared to admit, that he had humiliated her, not for touching the piano, but for daring to cross the invisible line he drew between himself and everyone else. And yet she hadn't retaliated with anger. She had responded with music, with grace, with truth. The revelation was as unsettling as it was undeniable. She had more dignity in that single act than he had shown in years of living. He looked at her again, truly looked this time, and saw not a maid, not an employee, but a person carrying resilience in her silence and strength, in her vulnerability. The transformation wasn't hers alone. It was his. A crack had opened in his armor, and through it, the boy his mother once raised was reaching out, reminding him that there was still time to decide differently. The room remained hushed, waiting for what would come next. Mr. Thompson felt every pair of eyes on him, but for once, the weight of their expectation didn't matter. What mattered was the unspoken question rising inside him. Was he willing to see the dignity of others, to let it change him, or would he retreat back into the safety of arrogance? His chest tightened, and he realized this wasn't about Emily touching his piano. It was about whether he could still touch his own humanity. Emily shifted slightly on the bench, her gaze steady, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She didn't demand an answer, but she gave him space to find one. And as the silence stretched, the mansion itself seemed to lean in, the walls and the chandeliers and even the polished Steinway, waiting to witness what kind of man he would choose to be in the next breath. The last overtones faded into the high ceiling like breath on a winter window, and the house absorbed them the way a person absorbs a truth they can't unhear. Emily didn't flinch or fold or rush to apologize for taking up space. She let the quiet settle around her, and then lifted her chin, not in challenge, not in defiance, but with the kind of composure that comes from knowing you didn't borrow your worth from anyone else. Her eyes met Mr. Thompson's, steady and human, and in that meeting the room felt a precise shift, like a compass needle correcting itself after years of interference. This was the point where the story's gravity changed hands, not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with presence. Mr. Thompson's mouth opened slightly and then closed again, as if a sentence had begun without his permission, and he wasn't sure how to finish it. The man who always had language ready, who managed any room, with a sentence or a raised eyebrow, found himself unable to locate the old script. He had walked into that living room, holding authority like a gavel. He now stood there, holding silence like a mirror. And that mirror did not show him the conqueror of markets, but the boy who'd once learned from a mother who measured power in kindness. His posture loosened by degrees, invisible to anyone not watching closely. But everyone was watching closely. Emily smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt and rested one hand back on the closed fallboard, the gesture unhurried. "I didn't mean to disrespect your home," she said, voice even. "I only wanted to remember what made me feel like a person." The sentence landed without weight on his pride and heavy on his conscience. It didn't accuse, it revealed. That small difference rewrote the entire atmosphere. In the doorway, Olivia understood what she was seeing and felt the prickle of recognition at the base of her neck. There was the surface. Narrative, Maid, millionaire, piano, but beneath it ran the real story. Mindset, decisions, transformation. She had come to the suburbs to admire a house. She was leaving with a different kind of architecture in her head. James shifted a step closer to the bench, as if proximity could help him memorize this moment. He was used to power performing itself. He wasn't used to dignity appearing without permission. The staff who had gathered behind the columns stayed absolutely still, each person measuring the impact in their own register. Mrs. Green held a hand against her chest, counting the seconds as the balance of the room reassembled. Josh, who usually scanned for exits and threats, realized he was scanning for something else. Whether the man of the house would choose a new pattern or retreat to the old one. Even the florist, ribbon forgotten in his hand, took one small step deeper into the living room, caught between the behind-the-scenes world he inhabited and the front of house. Revelation he'd just witnessed. "Emily," Mr. Thompson said, and the name sounded different this time, as if he were trying out a note he'd always played wrong. He glanced at the Steinway, then back at her, then at the witnesses whose faces reflected a truth he could no longer outvote. He had the deed, the payroll, the history of command. She had the room. It was not subtle. Respect had migrated, quietly, firmly, as if it had always belonged to the one willing to tell the truth without raising her. A voice. The moment didn't need permission to expand. It did it on its own. Emily felt the trembling that had threaded through her earlier dissolve from her muscles and reappear as a grounded calm. She did not fill the silence with explanation. She did not reach for apology like it was oxygen. She allowed everything to be exactly as it was. The gleam of the piano, the weight of the mansion, the witnesses, the complicated man standing before her and being asked by the moment to be simpler. Her stillness wasn't a tactic, it was citizenship in her own life. "I was wrong," Mr. Thompson tried and then stopped because the words didn't know where to land yet. He looked at his hands and realized they had been clenched. He opened them, startled by the small ache that announced how long he had been bracing himself against the world. He swallowed. "I did not see you." There it was. Not a polished sentence, not a legal concession, but a human one. The admission changed the temperature in the room a few degrees. Emily nodded once, not to absolve him or to punish him, but as acknowledgement that the first honest thing had been said. "Most people don't," she replied. "Not really. They see the uniform." "I saw the rule," he said, almost to himself, and the words worked backward through his memory like a hand searching for a switch in a darkened hallway. "I didn't see the person behind it." For a man who lived by control, the confession felt like stepping off a curb at night and finding the street lower than expected. He wobbled, just enough to recognize that balance requires humility. Olivia exhaled in a slow stream and wiped under one eye. "That was extraordinary," she whispered. And then, forgetting the social choreography of these halls, she added, a little louder, "You were extraordinary." Emily's eyes softened with thanks. She didn't bow her head. The language of deference had left her body. James finally found his voice. "I thought I understood music." He muttered, not looking at anyone in particular. Turns out I've mostly understood noise. The line wasn't clever. It was accurate. Accuracy has a way of sounding profound when a person finally stops performing for their own reflection. In the kitchen, someone set a cup on a saucer and then left it there, unwilling to break the spell with the clink. The housekeeper took half a step toward Emily and then stopped, recognizing that walking the last distance for her would be stealing a piece of the dignity she'd just earned. Respect also means letting someone stand alone and be seen as they are. Mr. Thompson's gaze returned to the piano. He had bought it to say something about himself and learned, in less than 5 minutes of music, that it had always been waiting to say something to him. He felt a flush of embarrassment. How many dinners had he introduced it like a trophy, while never once inviting it to do its work? The hidden truth of his curation was suddenly plain. He had collected artifacts of meaning to avoid the vulnerability of meaning itself. "My mother would have asked you to play again," he said, a slant of a smile ghosting across his face and vanishing. "She would have made pancakes and told me to listen better." Emily let that land. "She sounds kind," she said. "She was," he answered, and the present tense tried to form before he corrected it. "She mattered in ways I'm only just remembering." Momentum had shifted inside him. Not a dramatic reversal, not a spectacle, but the first careful step in a different direction. If transformation has a sound, it's quiet. The power dynamic finished its migration. It didn't settle on Emily like a crown. It settled on the room like an agreement. The person with the least status had just demonstrated the most leadership by refusing to humiliate in return, by insisting on truth over triumph. The mansion didn't quite know what to do with that, but the people inside it did. They stood in the reconfigured space and recognized that authority built on fear collapses in the presence of earned respect. "I can't take back what I said," Mr. Thompson admitted. "I can decide what I say next." The sentence surprised even him. He had always used decisions to impose outcomes on other people. Now he was using a decision to adjust himself. That difference fractured something brittle in his chest. Emily stayed with the simplicity. "Decisions are how we show what matters," she replied. "Not the big ones everyone sees, the small ones." Nobody claps for. There was no applause, only a hum of awareness passing from one witness to another like a candle flame. Josh cleared his throat, not to reset the scene, but because his body was telling him he'd been holding it together too tightly. The florist set the ribbon down on the console like an offering and quietly straightened one stem in the nearest arrangement, the universal human instinct to tidy as a way to honor what's sacred. Mr. Thompson looked at the staff gathered in the periphery and then back to Emily. He saw, perhaps for the first time, the behind-the-scenes economy of dignity that made his front-of-house life possible. People had been translating his demands into hospitality, his preferences into rituals, his impatience into polish. They had been playing a kind of music too, and he had never once turned to listen. The revelation didn't scold him. It reorganized him. "I've been proud of the wrong things," he said. "I can feel that." He didn't dress the sentence in abstractions or philanthropic promises. He left it plain, because plainness is what truth wears when it's tired of being pitched. Emily's shoulders eased a fraction, and a very small exhale slipped out, not of relief, but of permission. Permission to be in this room, as herself and not as a prop. "Then let the right things get louder," she said, fingers brushing the fallboard once, an unconscious blessing. The chandelier sent a faint tremor of light across the lid. The afternoon shifted. Toward evening, that thin, forgiving hour when everything looks briefly truer. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock remembered its job and chimed, each note modest, like a witness putting something on the record. Olivia stepped into the living room fully now, crossing the invisible line between guest and participant. "It changed the room," she said to no one and everyone. "Not just the music, what we're allowed to be in it." James nodded. He wasn't ready to speak again. He was busy, reassigning categories in his head. Value, performance, worth. In another life, he would have posted a line about it online. Here, He let it be a private correction. Mr. Thompson inhaled, and the breath carried the weight of a decision unfolding. He wasn't redeemed. Redemption is a longer journey, but he had turned toward it, and that turning has its own glow. He looked at Emily without the buffer of status and discovered something obvious. Respect makes distance unnecessary. "If you're willing," he said, "I'd like to—" The thought trailed off, not because he lacked ideas, but because he finally understood the cost of naming something before you've earned it. He defaulted to honesty. "I'd like to listen more." Emily allowed herself the smallest smile, not approval, not victory, recognition. "Listening is a good start," she said. "It's how you tune anything that's gone out of key." Around them, the mansion found its new normal, slightly shifted on its foundation the way a person shifts on a chair to sit without bracing. The staff began to move again, slowly, careful not to disturb the clarity that had been placed in the center of the room. The pianist who belonged at the piano and the owner who had used it as a shield stood in a moment of parity neither had anticipated. It wasn't fragile, but it was new. From the kitchen, a warm smell, something buttery, floated into the hall as if the house itself had decided to soften. The sound of a distant drawer opening and closing, the collective choreography of people returning to their roles with altered posture, formed a gentle underscore. The transformation did not erase hierarchy, it recalibrated it. Emily rose from the bench, not in retreat, but as someone who had completed a piece of work and was ready for the next measure. She didn't step back. She stepped to the side, leaving space at the instrument like an open door. "You said you used to play," she offered, quiet enough that the invitation felt like a shared secret, rather than a spectacle. "If you want to remember, I can make room." Mr. Thompson looked at the bench and back at her. The proposal contained more than music. It contained the possibility of a new pattern, of mentoring that wasn't top-down, of dignity shared rather than rationed. His throat tightened with the almost yes. "I might," he answered, and the honesty of uncertainty held more courage than any yes he could have faked. The witnesses did not cheer. They didn't need to. What had just happened didn't require noise to prove its impact. In the subtle choreography of glances and breaths, a new arrangement settled, the kind that lets a story continue without pretending it has already finished learning what it needs to learn. Emily's hand, still resting lightly on the edge of the piano, traced a small circle on the lacquer, as if blessing the next choice without naming it, and in that held breath between what had been played and what might be played next. The room leaned naturally toward what would follow, ready to see where this quiet turn would lead. For a long breath, no one moved, as if any sudden gesture might disrupt the fragile geometry of what had just rearranged the room. Then Mr. Thompson turned, not away from Emily, but toward the semicircle of witnesses who had been drawn into the moment. The staff, the guests, the quiet machinery of the house that had long learned to operate invisibly. His chest rose once, a visible reset. The old muscle memory of control tried to seize the scene, to turn feeling back into protocol, but something inside him overruled it. He stepped closer to the Steinway and to Emily, and then, in a voice that carried without force, he said the words, "People never expect from men who own everything. I owe you an apology." The phrase entered the space like a key, fitting a lock no one believed would ever turn. He didn't look at the floor when he said it. He looked at her. "I spoke to you as if your dignity could be suspended by my rules." "It can't. I was wrong." A tremor moved through the group, the way a ripple moves across a lake when a stone is dropped. Olivia blinked, her hand hovering near her collarbone as if she'd felt a physical jolt. James ran a hand along his jaw, not to pose, but because he needed something to do with the new awareness in his body. Mrs. Green's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't fight their way out. They arrived like witnesses, willing to sign a name. Even Josh, who had trained himself to interpret scenes in terms of risk, recalculated the threat level to 0 and replaced it with something he didn't have a checkbox for: respect. Emily held his gaze. There was no triumph in it, no hurry to convert his remorse into a transaction. "Thank you for saying that," she answered, quiet and even. "I needed to hear it." The sentence wasn't performative. It was a ledger entry made in ink. She added softer, "I didn't want to win anything. I just didn't want to disappear." A stillness. You followed, not the brittle kind that preludes judgment, but the supple kind that allows a new pattern to take hold. Mr. Thompson drew a breath that sounded like starting over. He glanced at the piano, then back at her, as if the instrument might loan him a map for the next decision. "I can't erase how I acted," he said, "but I can change what I do from here." The language of outcomes, his native tongue, felt different in his mouth when he aimed it inward. "If you'll let me, I'd like to support your music, lessons, time, whatever it takes to let that gift grow, not as a favor, not as charity, as recognition. You have something rare." He paused, choosing not to dilute the core offer with qualifiers. "I see that now." The reaction was immediate and unpolished. A small sound escaped Mrs. Green, halfway laugh and halfway sob. The florist actually clapped a hand over his mouth to keep whatever wanted to leap out from taking the room hostage. Olivia exhaled so fully it was as if she'd been holding her breath all year. James's eyebrows lifted with a humility he hadn't worn since he was 19, and someone told him the truth about himself that ended up saving him. Behind the scenes, a dishwasher clicked off and stayed off, as if the house itself had decided noise would be disrespectful. Emily didn't rush to accept. That was not caution, it was sovereignty. "I don't want to be a mascot for your change," she said, not unkindly. The boundaries were clear in her tone, the ones that protect a person's journey from being turned into someone else's redemption arc. "I want to be a musician. If your offer helps with that, I'll listen." "Good," he said, relief and respect arriving together. "That's exactly right." He turned to the people gathered, his audience but no longer his chorus, and addressed them with the same transparency he'd afforded her. "I've used this house to project an image," he said. "A lot of it has been about control. The hidden truth is that control is a poor substitute for meaning." He glanced at the piano, the chandelier, the framed art that had performed as proof of taste. "I've collected symbols and neglected what they symbolize." His admission didn't sag into self-loathing. It stood upright, as if shame had been replaced by responsibility. "That changes today, not in speeches," he added, preempting his own habit. "In decisions." Olivia's voice found its shape. "It matters that you said that out loud," she told him, then turned to Emily. "It, matters more that you held your ground," she smiled. "The kind that isn't for the camera but for the person in front of you. If you want names of teachers in the city, I know people, not the pretentious ones, the ones who actually care." Emily's eyes brightened, then steadied. "I'd take those names," she said. "I want the kind of training that doesn't sand the soul off the music." The line drew a low hum from James, agreement articulated as sound more than language. He stepped closer, extending a card only because form still has its uses. "If you need a rehearsal space sometimes," he offered, "I help manage one near the river. Keys and calendar are easier than you think." He caught himself and added, "I don't mean to overstep." The old version of him might have led with access as currency. This version offered it as infrastructure, a difference you can feel but can't hashtag. "Thank you," Emily said, taking the card without letting it define the exchange. "I'll reach out if it fits the plan." Plan. The word landed with purpose, not with pressure. Her mindset had always been practical. Music wasn't a rescue fantasy, it was the engine of a life. She could feel something aligning, the journey expanding, not exploding. The impact of the afternoon wasn't spectacle, it was calibration. Mr. Thompson turned slightly to include the staff along the edges, those who had become so adept at erasing themselves that they nearly succeeded. "I've treated you as invisible infrastructure," he told them. "You're not. I am sorry. I intend to rebuild the way this house runs, so it honors the people who run it." Mrs. Green straightened without meaning to, her spine remembering its natural length. Josh nodded once, a salute without ceremony. The florist released his ribbon and let it coil gently on the table. The small surrender of someone who doesn't need to hold everything together alone. Emily looked from face to face and felt a quiet pride that wasn't possession. I can't carry everyone's expectations, she said, mostly to herself and a little to the room. But I can carry this music. She tapped the fallboard once with her fingertips, not to perform, but to bless the work that would follow. I'll need time, and I'll need to keep my job while I study. There it was again, dignity refusing to become decoration. You'll have both, Mr. Thompson replied. Flexible hours, paid, and I'll fund lessons on your terms. Teacher, schedule, tempo. I won't sit in on them. I won't report on them to anyone. I'll remove obstacles, not manage outcomes. It was a sparse promise, and because of that, trustworthy. He had finally learned that support which announces itself too loudly is often interested in its own echo. From the kitchen a timer chimed and cut itself off, embarrassed to intrude. The house recalibrated, the way people do after a revelation when they still have to make dinner. Real life rarely offers the luxury of suspending logistics for enlightenment. The trick is to let the enlightenment change the logistics. That would be the behind-the-scenes test of today's decisions. Olivia eased onto the edge of a chair, careful, like she didn't want to bruise the air. "What do you want, Emily?" she asked, not as a social prompt, but as an invitation. Emily took her time answering. She imagined a small studio with a window, a teacher who saw her, mornings where scales felt like prayer, evenings where she played until the day let go of its noise. "I want to learn," she said, properly. "I want to be able to read anything you put in front of me and also trust the part of me that doesn't need notes to find a story. I want to audition for something real when I'm ready, and I want to send money home without watching the numbers like they're enemies." She exhaled, and a smile nudged the corner of her mouth. "I want to be proud of the choices, not just the outcomes." "You already are," Mrs. Green said, the certainty in her voice the kind that none of them would argue with. "But it'll be good to have the paper to wave at the world when it forgets." Mr. Thompson moved toward a small writing desk near the window, opened a drawer, and took out a checkbook he used mostly for ceremony, now that wires and transfers had replaced ink. He didn't write a number. He placed the book on the desk like a placeholder for a promise, and turned back. "We'll set this up properly," he said, "not as a handout, as an agreement to invest in something that has already proven its return." He stopped himself and smiled, crooked, self-aware. "Old habits, but you understand me." "I do," Emily said, amused at the vocabulary but not offended by it. "As long as the return we're talking about is music." "It is," he answered. "It has to be." James glanced toward the window, where late afternoon had begun to gather into that blue hour that makes even hard cities look soft. "It's wild how fast a room can change," he said, "more to the light than to the people. 1 hour ago, this felt like a museum. Now it feels like a studio." The comment wasn't poetic, so much as accurate. Accuracy had become the currency of the day. Josh checked the hallway out of reflex and found nothing waiting there but the same life they had all walked in with, somehow lighter. "You need anything, Ms. Miller?" he said, catching himself and correcting with a small grin. "Emily, you tell me." It wasn't a line of protection. It was an invitation into a different kind of security. Emily nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I'll ask when I need to." Independence and interdependence can sit at the same table when respect writes the seating chart. Mr. Thompson returned to the piano and laid his palm on the lid, not possessively, but like someone greeting an old friend after a long argument. "My mother used to say, 'The room should be better after the music than before it,'" he said. "I thought she meant tidier. She meant kinder." He looked at Emily, and then at the faces around him. "I would like to try to be a better room." The line would have been sentimental coming from the man he was this morning. From the man in front of them now, it landed with the tenderness of a first admission. Emily's expression warmed, less a smile than a softening of the corners. "Then keep listening," she said. "That's how any instrument learns the truth it was built for." She eased the bench back an inch and stood, not retreating, but letting the space breathe. Her hands fell to her sides, open. "I have a lot to learn, and I will learn it." The commitment wasn't loud. It didn't need to audition. It simply found its place in the architecture of what came next. The house obeyed the shift. Footsteps resumed, but gentler. Voices returned, but lower, respectful of a new center of gravity. Somewhere a door clicked shut, with the courtesy of someone choosing to give privacy to a fresh start. The smell of something baking drifted in again, and this time it felt less like background and more like hospitality. Redemption, it turned out, had a domestic scent. Olivia rose, smoothing her skirt, and said to Emily, "I'll send that list tonight. The good ones, not the ones who teach technique like it's a costume. You'll know who fits." Emily nodded, accepting not just the names, but the faith behind them. James tucked his card away because she had taken it. He didn't need another copy to prove the moment had happened. Mrs. Green moved toward the kitchen, then paused to squeeze Emily's hand once, quick and firm. "You play like you were telling the truth," she said. "Keep doing that." "I will," Emily answered. "That's the only way it works." Mr. Thompson lingered by the bench, not quite ready to sit, not quite able to leave. The invitation Emily had left open on the cushion, remembering, glowed quietly, patient. He didn't rush it. He let the possibility hum in the corner of his mind, like a light left on for when you're ready to come home. "Tomorrow," he said to no one and to himself. "Tomorrow I'll make calls, set things in motion." Then, catching the old cadence in his phrasing, he amended, "And today I'll keep my mouth soft." Emily laughed once, a small bell of sound that gave the room a last gentle polish. "That's a good practice," she said. "It helps the hands, too." She gestured toward the keys without touching them. "They play better when the jaw isn't clenched." He nodded, surprised by how literal the wisdom felt in his body. "Noted," he said, and it sounded nothing like a corporate note to self and everything like a promise. Evening had begun to lay a blue wash over the windows, the kind of color that makes reflections clearer. The Steinway reflected two figures now, not owner and employee, but students of the same lesson, at different chapters. The mansion wore the look of a place that had finally admitted the point of its grandeur, to hold moments like this without swallowing them. The apology had been made, the offer had been extended, the terms had been set, with humility and accepted with care. The humiliation that started the afternoon had become recognition, and recognition had moved, step by step, into redemption. Emily took one last look at the instrument, not as a prize or a gatekeeper, but as a partner waiting for the next rehearsal. "I'll be back in the morning," she said, practical to the end, "before the deliveries. It's quiet then." She turned toward the hall, the soft thunder of a life reorganizing itself beginning somewhere just ahead, and the room, now attuned to the frequency of honest transition, tilted naturally toward the next measure, ready to follow the music where it would lead. The night settled over the mansion like a velvet curtain, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a monument to control, but like a vessel that had finally been reminded of its purpose, to hold life, not just display it. Emily's footsteps echoed softly down the hall, each one steady, measured, as if she was already writing her next chapter with the cadence of her stride. Mr. Thompson lingered in the living room, staring at the Steinway as though it had spoken truths he had spent decades ignoring. The guests remained quiet, not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence, each of them privately rearranging the architecture of their own values. What had happened here wasn't just a confrontation transformed into reconciliation. It was a revelation, a hidden truth brought into light by courage and music. It's easy to believe that status defines worth. It's easy to assume that the person with the bigger house, the sharper suit, the louder voice is the one who holds the keys to respect. But in that living room, the power dynamic flipped without negotiation or force. Emily, a maid overlooked by nearly everyone, had revealed a gift that no amount of wealth could buy. Her playing had silenced arrogance, humbled pride, and touched every heart present. That transformation did not come from rebellion, but from authenticity, from daring to reveal the strength she had carried quietly all along. Mr. Thompson's reflection was more than personal, it was universal. How often do we mistake symbols for meaning? How often do we collect trophies, titles, or possessions, believing they give us value, while ignoring the dignity of the people who walk beside us every day? His journey was not just about one mistake corrected with an apology. It was about rediscovering the mindset his mother once tried to teach him, that compassion is more powerful than control, that respect carries more impact than wealth, and that the hidden gifts of those around us can change us if we are willing to see them. Emily's strength was not in her defiance, but in her decision to meet humiliation with music. She could have chosen silence, retreat, or resentment. Instead, she chose revelation, and that decision became a turning point not just for her own life, but for everyone who witnessed it. Olivia felt her guardedness soften into admiration. James confronted the quiet shame of privilege unexamined. Mrs. Green stood taller, reminded that years of overlooked service were still part of the same dignity Emily had claimed in a single act. Even Josh, trained to assess threats, discovered the power of vulnerability as a form of resilience. Each of them carried away not just the sound of her song, but the impact of its lesson. The moral here is both simple and profound. Never judge someone by their position in life. Titles, uniforms, salaries, these are costumes we wear in society, but they tell nothing of the unseen symphonies inside each person. True worth is not measured in marble floors, bank accounts, or grand pianos polished to perfection. It is measured in the courage to live authentically, the humility to respect others, and the generosity to recognize talent and truth wherever it appears. Mr. Thompson, once so certain of his superiority, now understood this with clarity he could not ignore. The maid he had scolded for daring to touch his piano had, in fact, given him back a piece of himself he had buried long ago. His redemption wasn't just in funding Emily's education or adjusting his household. It was in relearning how to listen, not only to music, but to people, to lives, to the quiet signals of humanity that too often go unheard. Emily, meanwhile, walked away not with the weight of shame, but with the momentum of possibility. She had reminded herself of who she was, and in doing so, reminded everyone else of who they could be if they dared to look beyond appearances. Her journey was no longer one of invisibility, but of recognition, her resilience finally seen for the gift it truly was. The mansion stood as witness to this transformation, its grandeur repurposed by humility. For once, it wasn't the chandeliers or the marble that dazzled, but the invisible light of dignity filling the room. The lesson extended beyond its walls, reaching anyone willing to reflect. What hidden gifts are we overlooking in others? How many people do we dismiss based on uniforms, accents, or bank balances, never realizing they carry music that could change the room if only we listened? The story reminds us that respect is not earned by wealth, but by humanity. That compassion has the power to undo years of arrogance in a single moment of truth. And that redemption is always possible when pride gives way to humility. The impact of that afternoon was not in the applause or the promises made, but in the transformation it ignited. A millionaire rediscovering his heart, a maid reclaiming her voice, and a room full of people recognizing that true greatness hides in places we are trained not to look. The universal takeaway is one we must carry beyond the walls of any mansion. Never measure a person's value by the size of their paycheck or the polish of their possessions. True worth resides in the hidden gifts that can change hearts, shift perspectives, and remind us that beneath every uniform, every title, every role, there is a story waiting to be heard. Respect begins with the willingness to see, and humility begins with the courage to admit we've been blind. Emily's music accomplished both, and as the last echoes of her song remained etched into the walls of that house, the story no longer belonged only to Mr. Thompson or Emily. It belonged to everyone who had listened. It belonged to anyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. And it belonged to anyone willing to remember that the smallest act of truth has the power to shift even the grandest of rooms, leaving behind not humiliation, but recognition and redemption. The house exhaled as if lighter now, its silence less guarded, its presence more alive. The people inside felt altered, carrying the weight of a lesson that would not fade. And somewhere, beyond the mansion's high walls, the world waited for the ripple of this transformation to reach it, ready for the next note, in a song that had only just begun. And if you've stayed with me all the way to this point, I imagine something in this story spoke to you too. Maybe it reminded you of a time when someone overlooked your worth, or maybe it sparked a thought about the hidden gifts people carry around us every day. If that's the case, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to know who felt this as deeply as I did while telling it. If the story moved you in any way, a simple like helps me keep bringing these kinds of narratives to life, and subscribing is the best way to stay connected as we explore more lessons of humility, dignity, and transformation together. And before you go, there's a video right here that continues in the same spirit. It complements what we shared today and might be exactly what you need to hear next. Click and come with me there, and let's keep the conversation alive.